So,
thank you very much.
So thank you for...
You have half an hour.
I'm gonna stand up because I cannot present while sitting. I need to stand up. I hope that you can see and you can listen to me. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. I'm Michael Blanca Gubai, and I come from the Université Libre de Bruxelles in Brussels. And I'm gonna present today this paper that is joint work with a colleague of mine in Brussels. Just 1 second. It should work. It's not working. Yeah, it's working. So, first of all, in recent years, we discussed this already at length, we have seen a proliferation of regional trade agreements. Most of these trade agreements take a form of free trade agreements across countries. There are nowadays around 300 trade agreements ratified across countries. Almost every country in the world have at least one FTA with another partner. And so they increased a lot starting from the 90s, and we can see also here that there is a small slowdown in the last decades, but still it's hard to say that we are living a protectionist period, because anyhow the trend is still somehow increasing, and the world is much more globalized now than 20 years ago. What I'm doing in this paper is to look at what are the forces behind the ratification of these trade agreements. I will go much more granularly and in the details than what is usually done, because I really look at firms. So my idea is that when you have a trade agreement across countries, there are winners and losers. It's very hard to say that a country is winning or losing from globalization, but it's also hard to say that a specific sector is winning or losing from globalization. We know nowadays that there is high heterogeneity even within sectors. We know that there is intra-industry trade. So the same two different countries are trading the same product across themselves. The US and Korea are selling themselves telephones or other things. So it's like there is intra-industry trade, and this creates, of course, winners and losers even within narrowly defined sectors. And this, of course, resonates with the new trade theory. If we think of Mark Melitz, Ottaviano, and they developed this theory of heterogeneous firms, and among them there are some that gain a lot from trade and others that lose. If you also look at statistics in every country, we know that there is a very small amount of firms that usually export or import that are globalized. It's around below 10%, in some countries is around 5%, and all the rest of the firms actually are not integrated with the external market, at least not directly, sometimes indirectly, but they are not. These also resonate with the political economy view nowadays. If we think of Danny Roderick, he recently said that these trade agreements that are ratified across countries are often influenced by a small set of rent-seeking and politically connected firms. The problem is that it's very hard to understand who's winning and who's losing, also because the process of ratification of trade agreements take a lot of time, so it's like the market change and many things can change. But what I do in this paper is to use an event study, and I use the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States, to see if firms that lobbied for a specific trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, lost in the stock market. So the TPP, just briefly, was it was considered to be the biggest trade agreement ever they attempted to ratify. It was covering around 40% of global GDP and more than 1/4 of global trade. There were 12 countries involved in this agreement, and it was a very deep and comprehensive trade agreement. So the objective was to eliminate tariffs, but there were also a lot of provisions in terms of investments and intellectual property rights. So just to tell you the contribution of this paper, on the one hand, one of the biggest contribution is in creating a database, a lobbying database. So what I did is to collect all lobbying reports filed in the United States related to free trade agreements. For the specific purpose of this project, I look only at Trans-Pacific Partnership, but actually I created the whole universe of all lobbying reports related to all the ratification of FTAs in the United States. Yeah. So in the United States, lobbying is allowed, but if you want to lobby, actually, you have to file a report on the Senate of the United States, expressing how much money you are spending on the ratification, on a specific issue, and then also which issue. I'm going to show you afterwards like a picture of how does a lobbying report look like. So as I said before, I conduct this event study on the 2016 US election, and what we see is that firms that lobbied for the ratification of the Trans-Pacific Partnership following the election underperformed in the stock market. And this negative effect was very persistent and was correlated to the amount of money that firms spent on the ratification. There is a second piece of evidence that I will show you briefly at the very end. I'm still working on that, but the idea is that these heterogeneous gains from trade are actually highly heterogeneous, and these firms are able to also influence the content of these agreements. So I will show you that the propensity of lobbying of these firms is highly correlated to having some provisions included in the FTA. But I will explain that a bit better later. Let me skip the related literature, just for sake of time, and let me explain the idea of the event study. So what I did, as I told you before, is that I collected all these lobbying reports filed in 2016. So at the very beginning of 2016, Obama signed the TPP agreement. So there was a big conference. So Obama and the 11 other representatives of the 12 countries involved in TPP signed the agreement. From that point onward, the agreement was already signed and by all the participants, so it couldn't be amended anymore. Of course, it needed ratification across all the 12 countries. But the idea is that it couldn't be amended anymore. Firms that started to lobby, of course, they revealed their preference according to the FTA, and then actually a code if they were in favor or against the ratification of the agreement. And so the market participants start to perform like a positive expectation about the returns of this agreement. Let me just say that it never happened in the past that the trade agreement that was signed in the United States wasn't approved in Congress. So that was actually an exception. So everyone was expecting, since it was signed, that it was going to be approved. At the same time, 2016 was a very important year because the elections were coming, and Trump was very vocal against the ratification of TPP. But no one was believing him that he was going to win the election. Of course, at a certain point, we know very well Trump won the election, and of course there is a market, the market has to adjust for this new effect. So just to show you, if you have questions, please interrupt me and ask them whenever you want. So Donald Trump was highly opposing TPP. He spent all his campaign actually opposing TPP. He was saying that the Trans-Pacific Partnership will lead to even greater unemployment. The Trans-Pacific Partnership will increase our trade deficit. So he was really opposing the ratification of the trade agreement. On top of that, actually, you can see this is Google citations. So if you look at Google citations for the word Trans-Pacific Partnership, sometimes there are some big that coincide with the Trump's events. So this one here, so this one is the signature of the agreement. So of course there is a peak in the news. This one is even bigger, and it's Trump's acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention. So there are much more citation about TPP when Trump became the official candidate of the Republicans. And actually what I'm going to study is this effect here. So this is the day of the election, and it's November 8th is the day of the election. And the other effect, this huge spike, of course, is the official withdrawal of the agreement, of course. That day everyone spoke about it. But you can see that in the day of the election, many things happened. Of course, everyone was talking about Mexico, about the wall, about many things, other things. But of course, like TPP as well became one of the most important issues or salient issue post-election. This is a kind of a depressive slide because it shows that at the eve of the election, all bookmakers or all websites, the New York Times, Huffington Post, 538, that is like they all underestimated the probability of Trump winning. Actually, no one was expecting him to win. So the market as well, of course, incorporated this expectation. We can easily assume that since everyone was believing Hillary Clinton to win, the market as well was believing that. So let me explain the data a bit before, and then I will show you the results. So as I told you before, in the United States, all entities can lobby. The only thing that they have to do is that they have to register at the Senate in order to lobby, and they have to disclose this information according to a law that is the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995. In the past, there were already a lot of papers studying the political economy, but they were looking at campaign contributions. Lobbying data are much better than campaign contributions because with lobbying data, we can also target the specific issue. So we can control for the specific issue that firms are lobbying about. So what I did was to collect all lobbying reports filed in 2016, and then I did keyword search. So I collect all of them that mentioned either TPP or Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I tried to use different wording. I also misspelled the word in case someone misspelled them. So like I was able to find a couple of them more, not many, but of course, like you always try to do your best. And for the specific exercise of this paper, I focus on all the reports filed by firms. I have other projects on this database. I collected lobbying reports on other trade agreements. I have lobbying reports also filed by trade unions, by firms associations. So I'm working on many different aspects of that. But on this specific case, what I do is looking on lobbying reports filed by firms. From these reports, what I know is the identity of the firm, so the name, and how much money they spend. Sometimes I also know from the report itself if the firm spent money in favor or against it, because it's stated in the report itself. When this information wasn't disclosed in the report, what I did was to look for official statements from CEO or from the other company members to see if they were leaning towards in favor or against the ratification. So I'm not sure if you're able to see that, but this is more or less what you see. Let me tell you. So this is Qualcomm Incorporated. It's a very big multinational company in the United States that spent in the first quarter of 2016, this is $1,730,000, and that's the first page. So I know how much money they spent, when they spent, who spent them, and the lobbying activity. What's the general issue was trade, and then the specific issue is in support for Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I know exactly that these firms spend money in the ratification. So one of the important aspects is that for firms, it's very important to disclose this information, because if they don't do so, they can incur in fines and also jail time. And of course, if you stop reporting this information, first of all, you're going to lose the possibility of lobbying in Congress again. Second, of course, it's like a monetary punishment and then also jail. So it's like this information, yeah.
Just clarification, where does this money go? Did it go to Hillary Clinton, who was supporting
No, this money, no, these are not campaign contribution. This is lobbying expenditure. This money is money meant to influence or to like kind of push congressmen to vote in favor of a specific bill. So it's meeting, like really spending time meeting with congressmen, trying to lobby for their vote. So it's a one-to-one meeting, or it's like paying lawyers that go to Congress and meet with congressmen. All the expenses that are related to changing or influencing the voting behavior of congressmen. So in the specific case of Qualcomm, they have an in-house lobbying department. It's like you can either lobby with a lobbying firm. So it's like you go in Washington, you contact a lobbying firm in Washington, and then you say, can you lobby for me on my behalf? And, but this actually is not the most common way to lobby. Most of the companies, actually, most of these multinational, what they do is that they have in-house lobbying department. Qualcomm, for example, it has like a lobbying department in-house, and they have 10 different branches. And one branch of this lobbying department is only related to trade. Then they have one branch that is related to taxes, one branch that is related to migration, one is like land appropriation.
Just out of curiosity, like the company that lobbying the most, which kind of sector, like IT, manufacturing, or is very heterogeneous?
It's very heterogeneous. In terms of trade, it's like, of course, these are manufacturing firms. If you look at the firms that are lobbying the most across all issues, these are probably banks and insurance companies. But if we focus on trade, and actually my focus is on trade, these are manufacturing firms mainly. So this is the first result. As I was telling you before, firms tend to support the ratification of trade agreements. This is kind of in contrast with the 1990s views that all this liberalization was met by staunch opposition of import competing firms. the idea here is that these firms are very big, are multinational. They are able to lobby on their own. If you think of Grossman and Hellman protection for sale, he was saying that import competing firms were creating coalitions to lobby against. These firms don't need to form a coalition. If you think like Apple, it's like has revenues and higher than GDPs of some countries. They don't need to form a coalition in order to lobby. They are highly connected, and they always lobby in favor. I have another paper, if you're interested in the topic, where I explain exactly why this happened. I have also a model in which I explain why this is the normal outcome of the model. As I was telling you before, let me just show you briefly. I collected data also on all other kind of institutions that lobby. There are also firms, associations, and trade unions. You cannot even see how much trade unions are spending. It's so little. They always oppose trade agreements, but they spend nothing compared to firms. Firms are clearly the big players.
But one thing about trade unions is that they are not really seen nicely in the US.
No, it's not true, but then I have a paper looking exactly at trade unions. We can discuss about that. It's like I look at the role of trade unions, and I try to explain that like in light of the new backlash on globalization, and I explain the role of trade unions. But we can discuss that later. So what I did as well was to collect also daily returns of companies in the stock market. So lobbying firms are much bigger than normal firms because they are really like the most well-connected firms in the United States. These are multinational. So I focus only on S&P 500 in order to have a more homogeneous group. But I actually I mesh them with like I have all the firms that lobbied. But for the sake of the analysis, I focus on just the 500 biggest firms in the United States. And I collect daily returns, and I also compute abnormal returns and cumulative abnormal returns. This is the standard methodology for event studies when the event is like a big event as the election. And so this is the first result. The problem is that lobbying firms, as I said, even when you look at S&P 500, are larger than non-lobbying firms. These are total assets of non-lobbying firms. These are the assets of lobbying firms. So you see that they are much larger. So in order to have also a robustness check, what I did was to compare firms that lobbied on TPP with firms that lobbied on other FTAs. In the specific case, I look at Chorus. Chorus is the US-Korea free trade agreement. It's the biggest free trade agreement signed by the United States after NAFTA, but unfortunately NAFTA is outside my database because it was signed before 1994. So what I did is like I create also like a robustness check comparing firms that lobbied only on Chorus and didn't lobby on the TPP and firms that lobby on both and see if I find the same results. And actually, at the same time, I also control for the political leaning of these firms because, of course, this is an election. So I want to rule out that the effect is due to the fact that these firms were Democrats or Republican. And what I see is that lobbying firms actually pay higher contribution to politicians. So because they are bigger, anyhow, it's like on all dimensions, they are completely different from non-lobbying firms. But if you look at the distribution to Democrats and Republicans, you see that actually these firms give money, as all the firms in the United States actually give money to both political parties. This is very interesting. It's like when I was collecting the data, I don't know, when you usually think of Apple as being the most democratic firm in the United, or Google, or Silicon Valley companies that are very like pro-democratic, actually they pay around 35-40% of contributions to Republican and then 60-65% to the Democrats. So it's like they always contribute to both parties. It's kind of just to bet and be sure that like nothing is going to happen to me. So finally, we reach the result. These are daily returns. Then I will show you also some results on the cumulative returns. So you can see that the two trends are kind of co-moving, and here is the election. And then what I'm studying are these 4 days of negative returns. So firms that lobbied on TPP actually have 4 consecutive days of negative returns because they were expecting the agreement to pass, and then Trump won the election. So of course, like the market was punishing them somehow for what happened. I also can show you the longer trend. It's like a 1 year long trend, and actually they are co-moving over the whole line except for this like huge jump there. So I ran a difference in difference in order to see if this effect actually is not only on the graph, but actually is also in the data when we control for size and many other things. And the variable that I'm interested in is this delta. It's like it's the interaction of if a firm lobbied on the ratification of the agreement and post the election, so the day after the election. And how do I measure lobby? Lobby is measured in two different ways in this exercise. Either a dummy equal to 1 if you lobbied on the ratification of TPP, but I can also measure it in terms of how much money you spend. So it's like there is also this intensive margin, not just the extensive margin. And the election, of course, is just an indicator equal to 1 for times after November 8, so after the day of the election. And then I control here for firms' characteristics and time-fixed effects. So what's interesting is exactly this result. This result here shows that firms that lobbied, this is the dummy, actually they lost after they have a negative impact on their market returns following the election. So this is exactly the effect of the interaction. This is with the dummy and this is with the expenditure. In the second column and in the fourth column instead, I run the exact same exercise on the smaller sample of firms that lobbied on chorus. So it's like this is an even more homogeneous group, and even looking at that, actually firms that lobbied lost compared to firms that didn't lobby. The second thing is like I want to see how big is this effect, because if you look at daily returns, they're very volatile, and okay, I keep on telling they lost for 4 consecutive days, but how persistent is this effect? This is the cumulative abnormal returns. So it's like I see if they recovered after a while, and you can see that after 30 days post-election, firms that lobbied actually had this negative effect, and it was persistent. And you can also look at again at the intensive margin. So you have 3 different lines here. These are 3 different terciles of lobbying expenditure. Firms that spend the least actually are the ones that suffered least. So the market knows exactly who was benefiting the most. If you think of like lobbying as a revealed preference, the market knows who was going to gain the most. So of course, if you gain more, you spend more, and if you spend more, you lose more when the things doesn't happen. So this was really betting on the wrong horse, because these companies were really spending a lot of money for the ratification of this agreement. They were expecting this agreement to pass, and actually at the moment in which this agreement didn't pass, they lose all the potential profits that they were going to make from the ratification. The interesting thing is that all of this is just in potential, because the agreement wasn't existing yet. It was just signed, and the market was expecting some future profits for these firms, and these firms actually were spending money expecting future profits, and just expectation was enough to create this huge negative shock post-election. This is the exact same thing that I showed you, like in terms of in a regression. So you see that the effect actually in the cumulative abnormal returns lasts for more than 5 weeks actually for the companies. The last thing that I do is try to understand. 3 minutes, yeah. So I try to understand the determinants of corporate lobbying, and I do that. There is a very nice way to do that, because the 11 countries that remained in TPP after the US withdrew from the agreement decided actually to sign a new agreement called the CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it is exactly the same agreement as the TPP, except that they suspended 22 items from this agreement. They unanimously decided to suspend these 22 items, so we can assume that these 22 items, these 22 provisions, were pushed by the United States in the agreement, and all the others were very happy to get rid of them. So what I do is that I match these items with the SIC 4-digit classification code. So it's like I match them with the sectors, and I see that actually having a provision, specifically a specific provision in the agreement, make you much more likely to lobby on the agreement. So these firms, so I'm working much more on that on a completely different project. So it's like I'm trying to understand if these firms that are very highly connected not only are able to change the probability of ratification of a specific agreement, but are also able to influence the content of a trade agreement. And this is preliminary results that show that actually these firms are really able to change also the content of trade agreements. This is not related to tariffs, of course, because tariffs, they go to zero with an FTA. This is what we were saying yesterday. Now a trade agreement is 9,000 pages long, and most of the things are not related to tariffs, but are related to trade-related intellectual property rights, compulsory licensing, interstate dispute settlement mechanism, and many other things. And yeah, the conclusions, like you just heard all the results. So it's like these firms underperformed, and this effect was persistent and correlated to the amount that they spent. And So the nice feature is that this data is very, very rich and allows us to study really a lot of effects of lobbying on trade and to show the very granular effect of trade across firms, like in the very heterogeneous and granular effect of trade. And thank you very much for your attention.
I was just curious, very impressive work in this. I was just curious, if you run the same exercise on the day that the TPP was withdrawn.
Actually, I have the data. 1 second. Where is it? And it's here. So this is the withdrawal. There is a nice picture of Trump signing the agreement, and there is actually no impact whatsoever. But this is normal. Like if you think of the standard view of the market, actually, that wasn't news anymore. So it's like Trump was already very vocal against the agreement, and everyone believed that that threat was real. So as soon as you have the big shock that Trump is elected, you know that everything else is going to follow from that. So the market already updated and integrated all this information, and when he actually signed the withdrawal, there is no effect. And you can see here, this is day by day, and you see that there is no effect whatsoever on the actual withdrawal.
So where the market believed.
Yeah, that's also a nice feature of that, because like Trump tweets a lot. So it's like I showed all the tweets. It's like, and that was probably one of the few times in which the market truly believed that Trump was to be trusted. It's not true, because sometimes now the market still like move when he tweet about the U.S.-Chinese deal and it moves. But that time, the market truly believed that he was trustworthy. I don't know. It's like and so, yeah.
I'm still remembering Giovanni's wording: correlation is not causation necessarily. And I was wondering whether you have some data on the importance of the Pacific market to these firms.
I asked to have the when I was at Harvard last year, I applied for the U.S. Census because the only way to do that you would need the universe of firms and then knowing all like trends of trade.
How many firms are in your sample? Lobbying firms. How many are they?
Lobbying?
Yes.
Around 300 overall, but in S&P 500 is 130. Out of the 500 firms in S&P 500, 130 lobbied. But it's hard to, like, if I don't have total, like, export and import trends, it's like, I can show you that being in some sectors that were highly protected or, like, highly liberalized thanks to the agreement, so if you have some specific provisions, of course, it's like you lobby more. I look also at tariffs. Like in the other paper that I have, I try to look at the determinants again. So I show that if tariffs on your export good is higher, you're more likely to export. If tariff on, I use input-output table to see like what are all the inputs that you need to produce your good, and the higher are the tariffs on the goods that you import to produce your produced good, the more you lobby. You lobby more if the market is bigger, if if overall the US is exporting or importing more from that country. There are all these determinants are there. It's harder to go specifically to the firm as long as the US is not granting me the access to the US census. So it's like I'm still waiting for them to grant me the access to the US census. Once I will have that, I will be able to do much more. Right now, I just matched it with the daily returns and with Compustat data. Compustat is like it's this database of all the US listed firms, and I have a lot of information about these firms, but I don't have all the breakdown of trade of these firms.
Thank you. Simple question. How long did it take to build the database?
Around 2 years, I would say. It's like because it the problem is that all the lobbying reports filed. I collected all the lobbying reports from 1994 till, and I keep doing it. So it's like I'm keep on updating it.
You have
But
a
all
team or you're doing
no, I was doing it alone. Now I finally have research grants. I'm going to Zurich and I have kind of unlimited research grants, so I will put some research assistant to do that. But the problem is that all the lobbying reports filed before 2008 are not in digital form. So it's like the nice one that I showed you, that's okay, it's 2016 that is in digital form. All the others actually are scan-off documents that you cannot even download. So I had to create a program to do text recognition online. It was very hard to do. And also the Senate website allows you to download only 300 lobbying reports per day. So since I was very roughly doing that, I started to steal all the IPs of the university, and all my colleagues were coming to me saying, yeah, you're destroying the internet for all of us. And I was like, yeah, I'm sorry, but I need to have all these lobbying reports. But yeah, it took me a lot of time.
Thank you very much. Okay. The next one is Alida Sangrigoli. With the work done together with Anna D'Ambrosio, who is here, and Luigi Benfratello from Politecnico of Torino. The title is Foreign Direct Investments in Africa. Are Chinese investors different?
No, schiaccia col tasto destro e apri apri con chiudi? No, conviene chiudi questa pagina. Schiaccia col tasto destro e fai apri con dopo.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. You have 30 minutes. Magari puoi chiudere questa finestra. Modalità schermante. Okay.
Sorry, usually I do presentations on PowerPoint. This is my first one on that. It's